Hi, welcome to Texas Tracks and Taps. I'm Grant.
I'm Coy. I'm John.
On this episode one, we're going to get a little bit into our individual backstories, all the circumstances in our lives that led us to a love and passion for music, and just a little signpost along the way, I guess you would say, that pointed us and directed us in a musical direction, so to speak. I'm gonna get us started. For me, it was early on. Just I grew up in the church, and church music was always a big thing when I was a real little kid. And I grew up in the Presbyterian church, which was more of a formal kind of traditional hymns and things of that nature. Beyond that, my parents, I wouldn't say they were big music fans. At least it wasn't real obvious to me like they had a real passion for music. But we did have a turntable in the house, and we had some vinyls. Most of them were like piano music, piano concertos, Wyndham Hill, if you're familiar with them, Wyndham Hill samplers and things of that nature. So as a little kid, I would grab the big headphones with the big foam rings, and I'd throw those things on with the big full size audio jack back in the day and plug that into the receiver and put on some piano music. And a lot of times I did fall asleep on the living room floor just listening to piano music. So that's where my love for music, I think, really started. And I think my dad is a pretty big music fan, or at least he was when he was younger, and I think he is now. But like I said, growing up, to me, it wasn't real obvious like what all he was into. Mostly, he would listen to a lot of talk radio, WBAP, Texas Ranger baseball games, things like that when we were riding the car. But when he did listen to music, it was we had a station here back in the day in DFW called the Oasis Smooth Jazz. And he loved that smooth jazz station, man. Not big for me. I can't say I loved it.
My dentist office growing up loved that station.
Yeah. It fits real well in the waiting room or elevator or something. Yeah. So yeah, that was always funny to me, just how much he would listen to smooth jazz. So I grew up in a very religious, a very Christian home. I've already mentioned the church thing. So a lot of what I got into as a kid was Christian music. Got into the whole Christian rock and roll thing. Your bands like Striper, Petra, these kinds of acts. And for me, that was my gateway into to rock and roll. I had got into probably around fifth grade, more pop music, MC Hammer, Vanilla Ice, Milli Vanilli. All these things were big with my friends and stuff, and that was the stuff that you'd hear on the top 40 radio. So that's what I was into then, along with the Christian stuff. But then get into the 90s, get into middle school, and things start to open up a little bit for me when I start hearing things like Soul Asylum on the radio, and of course Nirvana, Soundgarden, the whole grunge movement came in. That was really earth shattering musically for me, and opened up a lot of doors to discovering new music. The very first two CDs, and it's one of those things I'll never forget, is just getting my own money from, I don't know, mowing lawns probably or something like that, and wanted to go out and buy some my own music. I bought a boombox CD player and two CDs, and those two CDs were Spin Doctor's Pocket Full of Kryptonite and uh, Pearl Jam second album Versus. Um, yeah, it's a great record. Still love that one to this day. And then from there, I had an older brother who was 5 years older than me, who was very into music, and at this time is starting to play music, play guitar, play bass, starting to get into bands and stuff like that. And so he was like hugely influential on my musical taste. When he'd not be at home, he'd be out hanging out with his friends, and I'd be at home, and I'd sneak into his room and grab some of his music, start listening to his music, stuff like Metallica's Black album, the Weezer Blue album, Smashing Pumpkins, Gish, and Siamese Dream, Swerve Driver, a really great British rock band, Rush, King's X. So yeah, that really changed things for me, just broadening my musical taste quite a bit, mostly in the rock genre. But just a lot of different stuff that I don't think I would have, maybe not would have discovered on my own. But he was a lot more clued into the music of the day that was really happening. Cool. Then just starting to develop my own tastes and just discovering things on my own or from friends. That's when the Toadies came into my life. Toadies' first album, Rubberneck, that album, that CD, me and my buddy, we would go and just drive around his car just so we could just put that in the CD player and just rock out to it. And we talk about wearing an album out. We literally wore that CD out. Like we had to buy it again because it got ruined from listening to it so much. Had a really close friend of mine named Jennifer. She got me into U2, which was another pretty pivotal band for me. And the way that happened was actually, I was familiar with U2. My brother had a couple of cassette tapes. I think their first two albums, yeah, October and I'm drawing a blank. Boy, yes. So yeah, he had those two on cassette, and I dived into those a little bit, and I was like, this is cool, but it wasn't 100% like sold out for him at that point. But she invited me over to her house, and she put the Rattle and Hum movie on and watched that. And after that,
It's a great one.
I was a YouTube fan for life from then on out. I just thought, you know, these guys are so cool. Bono's so cool. Edge is a wizard, and he developed such his own unique sound. So from there on out, I was a huge U2 fan. So back in what this would have been mid to late '90s, the music scene in DFW was, I feel like it was pretty flourishing, or maybe it's just perspective because I was more plugged in than I am now. But you had all these bands like Toadies and the Nixons and Tripping Daisy and all these bands that were coming out of Dallas that were getting some national exposure, some national radio play. And so that was cool. And so it seemed like there was just a lot of good music happening at the time. But I was still too young and my family too Christian to let me go to secular rock shows and stuff like that. But there was such a flourishing music scene that there was, even back then, like local Christian venues, like where you could go see Christian rock bands. And there was a number of them. There was a couple in Dallas, one called The Door in Deep Ellum, one called God's Place, which was actually, it was in a church, a part of a church in Arlington. And then Fort Worth, one that I went to a lot too, called Club 412. A little bit smaller and less known, but they had some cool shows, cool local Christian rock shows there as well. So spent a lot of time going to those shows, seeing bands like Stave Saker and Starflyer 59, and just a lot of those Tooth and Nail bands from back in the day were real big in that scene. And then I also had, at this time in the high school, freshman year, had friends that were actually starting to be in bands, in these local Christian bands. And one of them in particular, a good friend of mine named Tim Dunbar, and a couple of other buddies of mine I went to school with, had a band called 17. And I was basically like a groupie, to be real honest. I would just go to almost every show they would play, and they were great. They were a lot of fun, and they were actually pretty good. And then, yeah, so that was cool. It was cool to have some kind of attachment to that scene through them, meet a lot of other people in bands, so that was always fun. And just cemented more in me just that desire, just a passion for going to see live music and see live bands. um Something I've always enjoyed and still do to this day. And then I got a little bit older and taste again started to expand a little bit. Started hearing some stuff on the radio that was different from a lot of the stuff I was really into at the time, which is mostly just rock, alternative rock, pretty standard stuff, some metal, mostly harder stuff. But then I discovered a band called Sunbolt, and they had a big radio hit. The actual name of the track's escaping me right now, but when I heard that song, I was like, "Oh, this is very cool, but it's really different from the stuff I've been listening to." And they led me down a rabbit hole into like what you would call the alternative country genre. From there, I discovered Uncle Tupelo, the band that Sunvolt was basically spun off of. and then Wilco, which is also a spinoff of Uncle Tupelo. The two main guys in Uncle Tupelo went and both started these separate bands. Um, and then just from there, a whole bunch of other stuff. Whiskey Town, which led into Ryan Adams, and all those artists came to the forefront for me, and that became my biggest probably genre that I would listen to the most. And then after that, I would say the other kind of pivotal band for me was when my buddy from the band I was talking about, who I would go and see all the time, we were driving, I think probably to a concert or something, in his car, and he put on Jimmy Eat World's Clarity for me. So when I heard that for the first time, that also broadened my musical horizons quite a bit. I never heard anything quite like it. Honestly, haven't heard anything quite like it. Still to this day, I think it's just a brilliant album that doesn't sound like anything else. But that kind of got me into some emo a little bit. I won't say I was a huge emo fan, but there were a handful of those emo bands that I did really enjoy. But mostly Jimmy Eat World. Dashboard Confessional was a big one for me, and I still enjoy their stuff to this day. I'm still discovering a lot of new music. I still try to always like broaden my horizons as much as possible. There are things that I don't like that I'm probably never gonna, but that's okay. But I'm always interested in new stuff and finding new artists. I don't want to stay stagnant. I think a lot of people my age, older, they discover bands at a certain age, probably when they're teens to late 20s, and they just stay there. They just stay with those bands, and they stop discovering new music. I never did that. I never wanted to do that. I didn't want to stay just stuck on these bands. Now I still listen to all that stuff, and I still love going back and listening to all the stuff I loved back then. But I want new stuff. I want to hear what's new, what's current. A lot of times when my Spotify put that on, I go to the release radar because I'll go down it, and a lot of it's not that good. And some of it I just listen to 20 seconds of, it, and I'm like, yeah, no good. But every now and then I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. That's really good, and found a new artist. And then another way I do that is by listening to podcasts. Like just today, I was listening to Vinyl Emergency this morning, and I was interviewed with Adam Duritz of Counting Crows, who is another big band for me. I didn't mention them in my backstory right now, but they were a huge one for me too. And he was talking about how Chris Caraba from Dashboard Confessional, they're good friends, and he was talking about how he had been trying to get like a co-headlining tour for like years and years because they've been friends for a long time, and their record labels or whoever managers promoters like just never thought it was a good idea. um, but as a concession or whatever, he took out on tour as their opening act, side project with Chris Caraba that I knew nothing about, but it's called Twin Forks. I haven't got around to actually listening to it yet, because he also talked about another band called Poco, which is a band that Graham Parsons started back in the day. I guess after he split off from the Birds. Uh, I'm not sure. I'm getting older. It's something like that. I know Graham Parsons was involved. Yeah, stuff like that. I'm just hearing what inspired other artists they're into, and then checking that out and going down those rabbit holes and just finding new stuff. I'm gonna let someone else talk now and tell their story.
I'll jump on it. I'll also mention part of our name is does have to do with this, and so I think we're all drinking the same thing today, right, boys? Give it a little
Yes.
smell. To Beach Feels Pina Colada from Odd Muse, Dallas
Yeah.
Brewery. If you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, and you like local beer, this is a fantastic. Graham and I were there for his birthday recently. Actually, it was on our list of on the brewery crawl that we wanted to do for his birthday, and I had this there and was like, "Oh yeah, we're buying that to go because it's fantastic." So yeah,
Very
yes.
nice. Go ahead. I'll cheers you. And I just really wanted you to plug the beer. If you don't mind, I'll go next with the backstory. But
That's all I'm here for, man.
yeah,
Get us
I just
the
wanted a
mug
quick
and
beer plug. I have a very different background hailing from South Florida originally. I remember growing up as a kid, my mom and dad used to have this little turntable slash cassette player, and it had two speakers that were detachable but could also be folded up into it. And there was actually a microphone that you could plug in. And as far back as I can remember, like 3, 4, 5 years old, I would sit down in the living room and play DJ with all the records and the tapes that my mom and dad had. And they had a very, what I would describe as odd collection of music. My dad, coming from the Philly area, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, there was a lot of Northern soul and a lot of what would be considered like doo-wop music from Philadelphia area in his music collection. But he also had an affinity for country music. So there was Willie Nelson, there was Merle Haggard, there was Waylon Jennings. I remember the best of Merle Haggard tape always being in that little box of cassettes that he had. But my mom's side, I believe she was the one that was really into the Beatles. And so there was quite a bit of Beatles that were in that music collection as well. And so my sister and I would sit on the living room floor and play DJ and play everything from the Big Bopper to Buddy Holly to old Merle Haggard songs and just pretend to be a DJ. And as I got older, I grew up in that MTV generation. So MTV launched about when I was in like fifth or sixth grade. And I also came from the era of what was called latchkey kids, where we were left home for hours at a time by ourselves. And we would sit and occupy our time watching MTV. And I can remember in sixth grade watching Wake Me Up Before You Go from Wham on MTV. And I was like, wow, I've never seen a dude with two earrings in my life until that moment. So that was my first exposure to George Michael and kind of the MTV type era. And having access to MTV, you listen to a broad array of music, everything from Madonna to Michael Jackson to Dire Straits. All those videos were just huge at the time. And I just felt like I had a really broad swath of musical influence at that time. And living in South Florida as I went into high school, while most of the kids my age were beginning to listen to heavy metal or some sort of metal, I remember one of my friends bringing an AC/DC cassette and having me listen to it on a Walkman. I actually went a completely different route. Two of the first tapes that I actually had were from Run DMC and from the Beastie Boys. And like Graham was saying, how he used to wear out the Toadies CD. I am positive I wore out multiple copies of License to Ill and Raising Hell. I probably bought each one of those at least 3 times, if not more, because those cassettes I would put them on play after play and just listen to them incessantly. And I really got into rap at that time. And I was listening to a lot of the rap that came from the South Florida area. I listened to some of the more nationally known or probably East Coast rap at the time, mainly from the New York area. But all the stuff that Graham, your parents probably would shame, like Two Live Crew and the Gucci Crew, like those were all things that I was listening to in my early teens. My parents didn't approve of it either. I just didn't let them know I was listening to it.
Sure.
But that kind of springboarded me into a completely different world. And in retrospect, looking back on it, I missed that whole metal and I missed that whole punk era of really diving into a lot of the music and getting into it. And it wasn't until I was like into my 30s and 40s that I really discovered all that music again. And I was like, man, I really missed out on a lot of this great music. But I got into rap and hip hop early on, moved to Georgia, lived in Atlanta, and immediately picked up on rap that was from the Georgia area. One of my best friends at the same time was listening to metal, so I definitely had those influences, and I knew of the Metallicas of the world, and I knew of the Teslas of the world, the band, not the car. I was listening to it in the car when I was with my buddies, but I was still pretty hyper focused on rap at that time. And it wasn't until the transition of what you're talking about, what you talked about earlier, Graham, with the early 90s and the grunge, for lack of a better term, movement. We had a great radio station in Atlanta called 99X, and it exposed us to a lot of the music that became popular at that time, not just the Pearl Jams and the Nirvanas, but I was able to be exposed to the Toadies living in Atlanta through 99X. And I can tell you 100% for certain, the first time I heard Possum Kingdom was on 99X in Atlanta. There were just a slew of bands that they exposed me to on that radio station at the time that blew up and became part of that grunge movement. And I think that's really where I made my transition away from rap. I stopped in the early 90s listening to hip hop and rap as much and really transitioned more into rock, and eventually took it upon myself to go back to listening to The Clash and listening to Sex Pistols and Fugazi and some of these older bands that I missed out on coming up into the 80s and the 90s. And later in life, that's really what I picked up. And as I moved around, I moved from Atlanta. Eventually, I did a 1 year stint back in Florida, but then wound up in Seattle. And guys, the Seattle music scene is just amazing. I moved there in 2003, long after the whole movement started, but they have such a vibrant and explosive music scene in Seattle. You can pretty much go see a band any night of the week in multiple venues. And it's just a great local scene. And I was turned on to a ton of bands up there that I had never even heard of living on the East Coast. Starting in like the early 2000s, I got heavy into listening to a lot of West Coast type bands, especially Seattle based, Portland based, Vancouver, BC based, just listening to that type of music. And I think we can all relate to having kids. Once you have kids, your tastes start to change. And I got turned on to some music. I don't know if you'd consider them emo, but Death Cab for Cutie was a band that I got into when my kids were pretty young, and tried to stay relevant with some of the newer music that was coming out of the Seattle scene. And I continue to really listen to rock. That's my core. I'm sure you can see the Pearl Jam poster up in the back. That's my band. The shirt's a Pearl Jam shirt as well. And I followed them through the decades as well and watched them grow. But now that I moved back south into Texas, I have picked up listening to a little bit more country. And I'm sure in another episode, I'll expose you to my approved country music, newer country music artists that I approve of. But I've rediscovered some of the music that's down here in Texas that I've missed out on in the past 15 years or so that I wasn't exposed to. And that's thanks to Coy and thanks to Graham. They're turning me on to a lot of that music. I've also explored the blues more than I have in the past, getting into Texas blues, but also some of the Delta blues and some of the Chicago blues that are out there. I think one of the things you said, Graham, is that you like to try to keep current and you try to listen to some of the newer stuff and always be evolving. And I think that's one thing. If you looked at the three of us, we probably are all very similar in that respect, that it may not be the same type of music that we're necessarily adjusting to and listening to, but we're always changing and listening to something new. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell and where I'm at. And I listen to pretty much all types of music that are out there.
Glad that John mentioned MTV. Growing up in Texas, and I was, even though we're close to the DFW area, I was out a little bit in the country, not too far from where I live now, but DFW's grown so much that now it's not as far out as it was. We're talking like we're Gen X or elder millennial at best. When yeah, there was a lot less out here when I was growing up, and didn't have cable out in the rural areas where I was at. We didn't even have a street address until they brought in 911 service. So it was like we just had a mailbox that was like, yeah, you're this box number on this rural route. Didn't have cable, didn't have MTV growing up, just had local stations that we could get with our antenna. Satellite dishes back then were like the size of trampolines, so we didn't have one of those. It wasn't really until I was like after high school for me, when before we got like a smaller satellite, that direct TV or whatever, that was much more satellite technology got better. And by that point I was moving out of the house. But so for me, like my earliest memories of music are similar to y'all's, and especially Graham, just because I grew up here too. But I was born in Midland, Texas. My dad was from Fort Worth, Lake Worth, actually. But he got transferred out to Midland with his job where I was born, and then he got transferred back to Fort Worth. Some of my earliest memories are Midland, Texas, and riding his pickup truck, smell of the leather, the dust from kicking up the dirt roads out there, and the AM radio picking up whatever country station. And so it was Willie Nelson, George Jones, Waylon, Hank Sr. and Jr., Patsy Cline. Those are my earliest musical memories, are all country. But as got older, 80s pop started to weave its way in. You couldn't get away from it even without MTV. Michael Jackson, Thriller, Madonna. They're exposed to that through, I think it was Friday Night Videos was my MTV. So it was like NBC had a time slot. Ended up turning into what's now, I think, the Late Show. But on Friday night specifically, they aired some music videos, and I think there was a host on that. I can't remember, but I think they went on to some prominence. But that's where I saw music videos, and I always loved movies and TV and film, and so the combining of music with short form film was always really interesting to me. So I got some more exposure through that. But then my parents' record collection, as well as you guys mentioned, had a lot of country or just Texas artists. So ZZ Top was in that collection. I remember Asleep at the Wheel. Gosh, we did have the Thriller album. But yeah, we had the stereo with the turntable, cassette player, AM FM radio receiver. I just remember, 8-track I think was on there too. Had quite a mix growing up. Once I got a little older, my sister, I'm the youngest of all my siblings, so my older sister, if she was driving around and I was riding with her, listening to whatever she was listening to, she exposed me early on to some of the like hip hop and things of the day when we got a little older. Tone Loc, Sir Mix a Lot. Who else? Who's the Bust a Move guy? Young MC?
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Got a little bit more exposure to things like that. But also, my parents liked oldies a lot too. So Elvis, the Beatles, Beach Boys, those were some of my early influences also. One of my first cassette tapes was the Cocktail soundtrack, the Kokomo single. I don't remember what was on side B, but side A was Kokomo, and I loved that song. And then I discovered the Beach Boys actually made music before the 80s, and it was pretty awesome. So one of my second cassettes was like their greatest hits. So I really liked the Beach Boys, really liked the Beatles as well. And then got into junior high. My friends started to influence me more than my family at that point. But when the Blue album by Weezer came out, I felt like everything I loved about the Beach Boys was in that band too, but it was modern and had been brought to another level and a younger, relatable, generational level for me. So that was probably one of the first albums that got me really into wanting to play music and not just be someone who listens to music. But I'd say another album was another one we've mentioned already, Toadie's Rubberneck. Although even before Rubberneck, my best friend in junior high, he had an older brother that could go to those shows that we weren't going to as junior hires. I was so jealous because they were seeing Toadies at Mad Hatters, I think was the name of that club. So I actually he made me a mixtape, because it wasn't really a mixtape. He just fully recorded the Velvet album that the Toadies released before Rubberneck on one side, and the other side was Smashing Pumpkins' Gish. That was the tape I wore out, and it was already worn out because it was a copy of of a copy. But yeah, mixtapes were a huge deal back then. I was like, if I liked a girl, I was like, I'm gonna make her the best compilation that she's ever heard. I think I have a box somewhere of mixtapes that people have given me from back then. It was cool. It was basically like writing a letter to your friend without any words. You're just creating the chapters and their song titles, and then you're just playing those songs. That was a big part of growing up as well. Other artists that I really got into at that time, like REM. And I had a phase right before that where like the Wayne's World movie was really impactful and got me into some like rock that I hadn't got into before. Yeah, just that was a great movie, great soundtrack. That is the first CD I bought when I got a CD player for my birthday, and I was like, "What am I gonna buy?" And I was like, "Oh, Wayne's World soundtrack. Yeah, it's got like such a great mix of songs on there." And just to round it out, I think the second CD I bought was Boys to Men, Motown Philly. So that's where I was at in like sixth grade, was listening to both Wayne's World and Boys to Men. So that kind of explains a lot about like how all the place I am musically. But then when I started playing, I started picking up the guitar around eighth grade. And then shortly after that, there's a band really influential to me because a person in the band was really influential to me, and that was Deep Blue Something. It was a local band from Denton. They had a huge hit in the '90s, Breakfast at Tiffany's, and I that was a CD that I listened to a lot at home. I actually had the locally issued version of Home that had Dear Prudence cover on it as the last track that they had to, when they got signed to Interscope, they had to lose that track for obvious reasons, but otherwise I
It's
think
a
it was the
really
same
great
CD.
cover, though. It's a really
It
good.
is a wonderful cover. And actually, like going back and listening to their earlier album, that's a great album too. Lead singer of Deep Blue Something, Todd Pipes, he taught me freshman English for a little bit. He ended up not finishing out the year because he was like, I literally saw him after he left from being a teacher. I saw him just a few weeks later on Conan O'Brien. It was like, this is
Yeah,
insane.
it's New York Rise.
Yes. And so super awesome, happy for him, and it was really. But I remember like I was still learning to play guitar and bringing my acoustic into class, and between periods or like a study hall or a free period, just like having him show me how to play something, or just I'm like, hey, there's a song I'm writing, and him just entertaining my 15-year-old self. So I've always had music friends that were in bands, like Graham mentioned, a lot of the local Christian bands I knew. Several of them I actually played in big bands with them at one point or another. They either left the band that we were in to go on to a better band, or it was like, yeah, we just play on the side. I started playing in church at that time too, and so I've played with some really great musicians that were in other bands, just playing church music, and I did that for all of high school pretty much, and then my 20s didn't really play music, but I'll say that that was when I finally got cable. And yeah, it was like, yeah, eventually at that point MTV wasn't playing music anymore. So I was like, oh, this stinks. But then I discovered Fuse, which was awesome. They still played music all the time, and they were newer out of Canada, and they like were all in on emo, and I was too at that point in my life. And Graham mentioned Jimmy Eat World and Clarity, and yes, I distinctly remember the first time I heard that album. And since Graham plugged a podcast, I'm going to plug Waterproof Records with Jacob Givens. His Clarity episode that he released, he nailed it. The way that
Yeah,
he described the first time you listen to Clarity, or really any time you listen to Clarity. So Jimmy World definitely in my 20s was a big influence on me, as well as several other Dashboard Confessional, several other emo bands. And then didn't start playing music again until my 30s, and at that point it was mostly in at church. And so I do have a quite a bit of like Hillsong United and Jesus Culture and Elevation Church, a lot of, and which ironically went to some of the same schools with some of those people too. But yeah, so like that was a lot of my 30s when I was getting married, starting to have kids. But I still always listened to rock, to emo, tried to stay current. But as John mentioned, when you start to get older, you start to have kids, like you just can't sometimes escape from some of the newer music. And even today with my kiddos, they are very into music, and it's Sabrina Carpenter, Olivia Rodrigo.
Sabrina Carpenter is actually pretty good.
I'm not complaining about any of them. They're very good. Chapel Roan is, she's doing her thing. I don't mind it when they want to listen to that stuff. It gives me hope. I do try to play them some of my music. I sometimes it's an eye roll. Sometimes they're open to it. But I would be remiss if I didn't touch on a particular band also that Graham had mentioned earlier, which is U2. I remember when the same friend that got me into Toadies and Smashing Pumpkin was like, Octane Baby came out and was like, you gotta listen to this. And I'm like, yes, this is awesome. And then I was like, what else do they have that I can devour? And Joshua Tree was the next one after that. And those are, you're going to start with two. Those are the ones. And so I was hooked at that point. I ended up getting Rattle and Hum and the movie and being like, oh yeah, I remember my sister used to rent this movie and like randomly every once in a while and watch it, and I was like just barely paid attention to it, but then I became obsessed with that film and that sound and that album. Went back and got their whole back catalog, got into the whole buying of import singles and remixes. I had a CD binder just of U2, and there was like my CD binder of everything else. People still think of me that I knew from back then. They're like, "Oh, U2, that makes me think of this." I got a text just a couple days ago. I have a friend. He was in Dublin in a pub eating an Irish breakfast. U2 was playing, so he texted me. He's just like, "Hey, just thought of you." I'm like, "That is the best text I've gotten in a while." But yeah, I'm like, I can look through my old yearbooks and they're just like, yeah, the guy who's probably going to get arrested for stalking U2 is my superlative most likely to get a restraining order.
How many YouTube shows have you seen?
Oh gosh, put me on the spot here, but think it's I think it's 9.
Oh, I thought it was okay.
No,
That's still a lot, but for some reason I was thinking
yeah, I'll have to double check my math on that, but I think it's
that's still a lot.
yeah. First big show was U2. I'd done a lot of the same smaller local shows like Graham had mentioned. I went to God's Place for their Tooth and Nail weekend. Tooth and Nail has a big place in my history as well. I should not.
Yeah,
should
it's
not
really
leave that
funny.
on.
And you didn't mention this in episode 0, the episode 0 that's actually gonna get out there to the world. But
It's already out there.
you didn't mention, like you did in some of the previous ones that we recorded, how it's really funny that like we never ran into each other
Yeah.
at any of those places.
Oh yeah, we were definitely at the same shows.
Until we were married, because my wife in high school and all that.
That's how I know Graham. Is I went to high school with his wife, and we met on a St. Patrick's Day. Just because I think it was MySpace. I was gonna say Facebook, but I actually think it was MySpace because it was that long ago. It's 20 something years ago. It was just like, hey, we haven't seen each other since high school. What are you doing for St. Patrick's Day? Meet my husband. And yeah, Graham and I have hit it off ever since. And it's not hard to know why. We had very similar musical upbringings as far as locally, and then our love for you too. Definitely, would have been enough on its own. But yeah, all those local shows at God's Place, all those bands that we knew the same people growing up, just somehow didn't meet each other. But that U2 show, we were both at that one as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was my first big
That
one. Well, like it had been to just the local Christian.
Yeah.
thing I mentioned. '97. It was the Pop Mart tour at Cotton Bowl. My first like secular show. It's crazy. That was my first show because it was such a big over the top concert. Yeah. Yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's not, you're not tiptoeing into live music when you go to that show for your first one. Ever since then, I've been to a lot of good shows, but that's still up there with one of them. And then Graham and I, along with our wives, recently got to see, I guess it was about a year ago, we got to see U2 at the Sphere in Vegas when they opened that venue up with their residency, and that was incredible. I don't even think you have to be a U2 fan to have liked that show because it was visually and audio wise one of the best shows I've ever been to, and then I happen to also love that band. But yeah, like I said, I know I left out Tooth and Nail. I'll give a shout out to Luxury as the band that I still listen to this day, and does have some Texas ties now, although they had Georgia ties originally. So we might talk about them in future episodes. The Smiths was another band that my buddy and I in junior high, his older brother, he just had great taste. The Smiths, Talking Heads, The Cure, and then Green Day's Dookie album was also up there on my Green Day, Smashing Pumpkins, Weezer. But I was definitely all Nirvana. I didn't have MTV, so whenever I stayed at a friend's house that had MTV, I was like, you get to watch this all the time, so I know you don't want to do this right now. We just have to watch it until Smells Like Teen Spirit comes on, and then we can go do whatever else. And there was a good chance it wouldn't take longer than an hour because I think they were playing it like every hour back then. And so that was like how I would get my MTV in, was like, man, I really want to see Smells Like Teen Spirit, but I don't want it to be too soon because I would like to see like Jeremy and some other great videos in that era. So yeah, I definitely was highly influenced by grunge as well, especially when it came to the music that I was trying to play as a 14 and 15-year-old kid in my garage band that I was in with my friends.
I wanted to give John a chance to touch on a big story that's It's been a few weeks now because it's cooled off a little bit, but it's still huge and impactful, especially in the Texas music world. And as the passing of Chris Christopherson.
Yeah, I was talking a little bit earlier about how when I grew up with kind of a crazy little mix of music that I listened to, and I remember sometime in the, I think it was late '80s, there was a band that came out that my dad really liked. It was called the Highwaymen, and I think we all know who was in the Highwaymen. It's all icons. Where we had Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson was in it, and Waylon Jennings. Very strong cast of folks in that band. And I remember saving up my allowance money to buy my first actual record, which was a 45, one of the smaller records. And my dad took my sister and I into Peaches in Plantation, Florida. I walked into that behemoth store and looked for the H's, and I found myself 45 of their first hit single that they had, where basically it was Highwayman was the name of the song. And so Chris Christopherson's always had an influence on me, and he's been one of those guys that through the years I have always listened to his music, and I've always thought that he is one of the greatest songwriters that we've had. There's a lot of folks that have been put up on a pedestal in terms of what kind of songwriting capabilities they have, and I think most of those lists would have a guy named Leonard Cohen on that list. And just to be quite transparent, like I never got him. I never got Leonard Cohen, but reading through Chris Christopherson's lyrics, he was always somebody that I can tell you I connected with, and I understood the lyrics, and it was just something that impacted me whenever I listened to his music. And reflecting back on him as a Texan, he was actually born here in Brownsville, Texas, and moved pretty early in life, but he still had great ties to the state. And as a country music songwriter and singer, I think he was beloved in the state. Like he was, a lot of people really respected him and his career. And it's really crazy when you look back on some of the things he did. Like I knew him most from his musical career. Christopherson had, I was just running through some of the movies that he was in. Convoy. He was in the entire Blade series, which I totally forgot that he was in that. He was in the original Stars, A Star Is Born. So before Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga did it, he was in the original with Barbara Streisand. And then one that I remember seeing as a kid, and I actually do have the soundtrack upstairs to this movie, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. So he was in that movie as well. And that's just a small collection of some of the movies he was in. He was in, I think, over 20 different films and TV series. But he was known as a songwriter, a musician, an actor. And just reading up on him, one of the other ways that I've described him is he was just a damn good human being. Like he was a really good guy. Sinead O'Connor had gone through a big shakeup, and it was a real hullabaloo of her ripping up a picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live. And so there was a time where Sinead O'Connor and Chris Christopherson were actually at the same venue and same stage. And the people in the audience started booing Sinead O'Connor, and Chris Christopherson came over, put his arm around her, and basically said it's okay, and tried to calm her down and try to soothe the situation over. Plus, he was, from a human perspective, battled for all kinds of different rights, and he was a veteran. He had served in the military, and he came from a long line of his family being in the military. He spoke out to some of the atrocities and some of the wars that he saw and some of the things that he didn't necessarily agree with. He was a trailblazer in a lot of respects, and really have a lot of respect for the guy. And it's sad to see an icon that I grew up with. I remember him from my youth leave us, but it sounded like he had a wonderful second life in Hawaii. It's where he passed. I know he lived in Hana, Hawaii, which is an absolute gorgeous place to live. And it's sad to see him go, but I'm curious, Graham Coy, how did Chris Christopherson impact you guys and influence your lives?
I always knew about him just because anyone that was Willie Nelson adjacent was going to be on my radar. And then, but I knew him from some of his acting. I don't think you could have avoided not knowing who he was if I was born a little bit earlier, because the 70s it was just like, especially when he got into film, he was everywhere. And it's just amazing to me. There were probably some people that only knew him from film and didn't even, maybe not even knew that he also had the storied songwriting career that he had as well. I was looking it up when we were talking about him originally, and when you factor in his like voice acting credits, he's got over 100 acting credits on IMDb, and he's written over 100 songs. And you can't say that about very many people. And while he definitely was on my radar, I've got a bunch of superheroes behind me. You probably can't tell, but those are Marvel. Yes, I knew him from the Blade movies for sure. Thought he was one of the best parts of the Blade movies. I'd want to go back, and I haven't actually seen any of the Star is Born movies. His and Barbara Streisand's was actually a remake. It wasn't the original. It was like a Judy Garland, I think.
Oh,
But I haven't actually seen any of those, and now I really want to, especially his movie. But he just seems larger than life when you look at his whole life and his whole careers, plural, because he definitely didn't just have what I would consider one career in show business. And it was like resurgences too. He, like, when he first came on, he's a songwriter. Then in the 70s, he's a movie star, and then he goes off the radar. But then he's really recording with the Highwaymen and doing his own thing with music again. And then he gets back in the movies again. It's every decade he's like, just like, I'll do movies, and now, and then he was starting to do music again. There's actually some not too long ago released music that he did, that you can find, and yeah, to be 91 and in Hawaii to end it all, it just, his whole life seems like a Chris Christopherson song. It's relatable. Like, you feel like you know the person. It speaks to you just because he wasn't. While he was a great human being, he certainly wasn't a perfect person. None of us are. But like, I think his ex-wife Rita Coolidge said, like, he's an amazing human being, but a crappy husband, to clean up the language a little bit. But that's still high praise from an ex-wife. But I think what was most interesting to me was just how they're gonna have to make a movie of this guy, and I'll definitely be first in line to watch it, because he first featured in Sports Illustrated as a boxer. So then you think, okay, he's gonna be this really athletic kid in college. And then he goes to college to be a writer, studies literature, gets published for his short stories, which gets him a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where he goes over to England. And already this doesn't sound believable, but that's where he first starts getting into music. He actually meets some Nashville contacts, and then he also goes into the army. His dad was a military man, so he was trying to do that. He's stationed in Germany, West Germany, and then was going to volunteer for Vietnam, but they actually wanted him to go teach literature at West Point, and he's getting ready to go do that, and then decides, no, I'm going to give up all the free life where you get paid to do that stuff. You're pretty much set, and to go try to start over and write music in Nashville. And he's the janitor at Columbia Records studio in Nashville, where Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash are recording. He's cleaning their ashtray, and he's trying to get his demo tapes to June Carter Cash in the hallway. And so the story goes that he's still on the side in the reserves, I believe, and or National Guard or something like that, and he flies a helicopter, lands it on Johnny Cash's lawn, and hand delivers a demo tape. Some say Johnny would say he hand delivered it to him. Sounds like it was actually Johnny wasn't there and he hand delivered it to the gardener. But either way, it got Johnny's attention, and the rest is history. They record Sunday Morning Coming Down, and he had a couple of other songs that were recorded by artists at that point that really got him on the radar. And probably, to me, one of the most telling things is the 1972 Grammys, I believe it is. 5 songs are nominated for Best Country Song. He wrote 3 of the 5 songs, and they were recorded by other people, but he wrote 3 of them, and he won. We had a pretty good chance.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. I think another thing that's a testament to him is you can take the same song and have different people record it and make it their own and make it a different genre. Like Me and Bobby McGee, it's a #1 country hit, and then Janis Joplin gets a hold of it, and it's the rest is history there too for rock. But he was writing for Al Green. Everyone could take a Chris Christopherson song, put their own spin on it in their own genre, or the way that they release songs, and it was a hit. and it's just that to me is amazing. That's not easy to do at all. So he was very much in demand, and just there's a really good reason for that because when I listen to his songs and the ones I've been listening to, I can't. Gosh, I know I told you guys when it's been a couple weeks now, but I was really listening to just these songs about that he had that were so great were about looking back on his life, and he was already writing these at the beginning of his career, but he had all these great songs about just reflecting and looking back and always taking in the journey. And that's what really I think speaks to a lot of people is just that makes it more than just popular music. It makes it impactful and it connects on a soul level. Graham?
Yeah, you mentioned how there's some people out there who probably just knew him as an actor, and I would put myself in that category. I think like I didn't really get into Johnny Cash, and then from there to Highwaymen until probably in my 20s, until I was quite a bit older. So yeah, I knew him as he was in a lot of movies and a lot of shows, like you said, from the 70s and so forth that I would see on reruns or whatever on TV. But yeah, just like you said too, just that I think a lot of people miss. They may not even know when they hear his name. They may not realize just like how prolific he was in terms of being a songwriter and just the songs that, like you said, like that other people recorded of his that he wrote. Just a huge impact, and I think y'all did a good job. Y'all did. Y'all have done a lot of research, and I appreciate it. But yeah, just he's timeless. He's legendary, and he's gonna be greatly missed for sure in the music world. Rest in peace, Chris Christopherson. You know,
Cheers.
cheers to
Cheers.
that for sure.
Are we gonna make a playlist that put it on Spotify or something where
Yeah,
kind of
absolutely.
listen to the songs that we've been listening to since, especially since the news came out a few weeks ago?
Yeah, we'll put a playlist Spotify and on YouTube for those songs for sure. When we started planning the podcast, that something that might be fun to do because some of us are, we all have our opinions. Opinions are like assholes, and everyone's got one, and we certainly do as well. And there may be bands out there that we might be dismissive and might not give a chance to without someone really pushing us to give them a chance.
Maybe we just never heard of them.
or you just never heard of them. That could definitely be the case too. Probably was what we're going to get into here is the case because there's a local band called Ishi, and Ishi is a kind of a electronic. I don't know if you'd say dance koi, but definitely an electronic electro pop synthwave kind of act that's a local Dallas act. And I actually went to high school, junior high, and part of high school with the guy, the mastermind behind Ishi. His name's John Mudd. Sweetest dude you'll ever meet. Just
Another person that I met but didn't meet Graham.
yeah,
I was growing
yeah,
up.
yeah. Crazy how we never met back then, but. Anyway, it sounded like Coy and I were tossing around different bands that we were going to try to get John to give a chance to and give a listen to and get his take on. And we thought Ishii would be a good one, might be a little bit out of his wheelhouse, so to speak. Might not be something he would normally listen to. Um, it's a little out of my wheelhouse too, to be honest. But I think in recent years, I have gotten more into that, and toward the synths, dance, electronic kind of stuff, and have found some stuff out there that's actually really good. And I think Ishii was a gateway for me into that genre. Yeah, that's your assignment is to give Ishii a chance. We'll send you some stuff as far as this is the stuff we think is the cream of the crop as far as Ishii goes. And I would say at some point we should check him out live because he puts on a good show live as well. They're always fun. Have you ever heard of them at all?
I'm not,
Yeah,
and
it's not really a them, but
Ishii sounds fishy, and I'm gonna give him a shot.
all right, man. Sounds good. So we'll circle back around on the next episode and get your thoughts on Ishii.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna talk a little bit about what we're gonna get into episode 2. We've spent a lot of time, a lot of conversation on coming up with a list of the greatest Texas artists. It was really challenging to say the least. What we ended up deciding is that we're going to have actually two, I guess it would be four lists. We're going to have a list that is our greatest Texas artists, just in general, overall, in the music world and their impact on music. So we've curated a list for that we'll talk about in pretty good detail on episode 2. But what we also wanted to do is give a personal best of Texas list. So the bands from Texas or with Texas ties that have influenced us personally the most. So we'll each give our own list there. Something to look forward to for us for the next episode. But for now, I think it's time to say so long, and we'll see you on the flip side.